College football nerds here talking football with Nerd Josh. This week he is back from vacation. For some reason, some people shouldn't get married during the fall. We're trying to get Josh to not go on vacation every year for a week during the fall. He picked one of the best weekends to do it, or worse, depending on how you look at it, because there's a lot of football going on. And Notre Dame versus Ohio State was one of those games, and we're going to talk Notre Dame Duke for a little bit. Just want to remind y'all, if you're new to the channel, even if you're not, please please subscribe. Helps us out a ton. And we're going to showcase a little bit later our model. This is the first week of the year that we can show the model, but a little interesting nugget is that you can go play with the model yourself. collegefootballnerds.com. You can compare any two teams you want, or you can do player projections on how Riley Leonard might be projected to perform against Notre Dame this weekend. So we will show you that at the end of the video. Got to hang out the whole time to see what's going on. All right, Josh, this game last weekend was interesting because one of the things that we've said all year is, look, if you're playing a monster out-of-conference opponent, or in Notre Dame's case, just a monster on your schedule that you voluntarily scheduled, you should get some credit for playing that game. And in my mind, Notre Dame should not be dropped in whatever rankings they were in. They probably should move up because I think people had them a little bit too far down. Duke as well, and we'll get to that in a minute. But as we get into this, I don't want to reflect too much on that Ohio State game because I know it's painful for Notre Dame fans, but just touch on a little bit the importance of us not punishing teams for scheduling these games and not just reflexively saying, oh, you got one in the loss column and knocking them down without considering the magnitude of the game and how everybody's performing around them playing cupcakes.
There's always a balancing act between wins and losses and overall quality when you're trying to do rankings. And the way that we've always said it is when you lose to a team, the assumption has to be that you would lose to that team every time, absent the other team having another loss that muddles the issue. So I think you have to put Notre Dame behind Ohio State in the same way that, a sane person might put, Tennessee behind Florida. But when you're doing that, I think you also have to recognize the fact that if they lost to a team that you thought would beat everybody else, you shouldn't necessarily drop them. I think Ohio State is a very good football team. And look, their offense is not where they need to be, but they're good. And defensively, this is much more like an old school Ohio State team. It's kind of funny. It's like they and Alabama both made a pact this year that they wanted to be back, like 2009 versions of themselves or whatever, where they're maybe offensively weren't on the same level that they are or had been the past few years, but defensively pretty darn salty. And Notre Dame, played well. They moved the ball well. They showed that they have a more dynamic offense than they've had in years. The defense played at an extremely high level. If that's all true, then this is still easily a top 10 team and maybe should get consideration even as a top 5 team, depending on how high you have Ohio State. It's just important in my mind that if you're ranking them behind teams, teams like Utah, who people have taken that a lot of different ways, but if you think Utah is someone that would beat Ohio State, sure, you can put them higher. But if you're pretty confident that Utah is going to lose to Ohio State, why are you putting them ahead of a Notre Dame that loses to Ohio State on the final play of the game? I don't buy it personally, and especially when you're dealing with teams that have a loss. So there's a lot of AP voters out there that I just think get a little too wrapped up, not only in wins and losses, but get too wrapped up on when those wins and losses occurred, and just play the game of moving teams up and moving teams down, which hinges all on preseason polls. You need to be looking at each team really every week on its merits based off only what's happened at this point in the year, and I don't think enough people are doing that. Not doing it with enough Notre Dame, and I know I'll make some people mad by bringing this up, but it's a point you've raised a little bit about Georgia and the contrary.
Yeah, we're going to have a transitive property discussion later, so I don't want to get into it too much, but I do think that it's really unfair. I know Michigan fans and Georgia fans are chirping a little bit right now. A lot of people have Michigan ranked ahead of Ohio State, and I think Michigan is one of the top teams in the country, but you can't just brag about being undefeated right now. That is ridiculous to me because some teams have played nobody, and some teams went out and scheduled somebody really good. Georgia wasn't their fault, and Michigan, again, gets back on the horse next year. But I think all of that is to say there's two things about it. One, we should really credit Notre Dame and Ohio State for playing this game and not punish Notre Dame for it. But also, we learned a lot of things. Really, to your point, if we think Ohio State is a top 5 team, then in my mind, top 3 team, then in my mind, Notre Dame is probably top 5, top 7, which means they can lose this game and still be firmly in the conversation for the playoffs. So I don't want Notre Dame fans to get too down on themselves. Over to you, because I took all the heat today, Josh, when I said, explain to me why Utah is ranked 7 spots ahead of Duke, and I got killed for it. And I still don't understand why. I'm going to let you kind of run with this for a minute. I got some comments on it too, but I want to let you run with this for a minute. One, I don't think people understand how good Duke is. And two, it sort of sums up the absurdity of another point you made about backup players and what you said just a second ago about basing everything on preseason polls.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Just pull the pen, hand it to me. Yeah.
And run away.
I think half the time of us on Twitter is one of us saying something spicy and then the other one trying to bail water for the person that tweeted it. Well, I think the first thing that happened is people on Twitter, this is shocking, but people on Twitter don't often always think through or read exactly what you said and respond quickly. And the key to your point was 7 spots higher. So the first thing I'll say is there's a difference in saying why is Utah ahead of Duke and saying why is Utah 7 spots ahead of Duke, right? Do you agree with that point as a basis?
I do, but I also would have Duke ahead of Utah. Sorry.
Okay, well, just keep lighting stuff on fire. No, I think the point of there is, well, there's really 2 things going on. One, there's this obsession with Utah fans or people that are pumping up Utah to say Utah keeps winning with their backup quarterback. And I was the one that made this point in response, so I'll fall on that sword. When it's week 5 and the quarterback hasn't started, he's not really the backup anymore. He's just this season's starter. And yeah, maybe Cam Rising comes back, but you're projecting a team based on a guy that apparently hasn't been healthy enough to play, coming back and being 100% off a torn ACL. At some point Utah is what it is. We give people an excuse for playing a week with a backup quarterback or what have you in spot duty, but it's really different situation when you're when you're doing that week in and week out. But to the point with Duke, I think there's a big point here in the fact that people just want to ignore what's happening with Duke and specifically the Clemson game. So with the Utah example, everyone likes to talk about how Utah has 2 ranked wins, and then yet in the same breath they'll say, well, they have 2 ranked wins and Duke has none. Well, Clemson was ranked when Duke beat them, but when Utah got their 2 wins, one was over UCLA, who's not ranked now. The other win is over Florida. And by the way, I think Clemson would beat Florida if they played today. You agree with me on that, don't you?
Absolutely.
So, when you put all that together, you end up in a situation where I think Duke has played at a higher level. And at some level, playing at a higher level has to matter. And I think it's hard for people to accept that Duke has played really good football to this point in the year. Looking at our, now we have these team statistic pages on College Football Nerds, and we have this thing called relative performance, which is a version of the intermediate statistics I've been using to generate the model for a long time, basically saying, how have you done against your competition as compared to what would be expected for your competition to give up? Basically a complete opponent-adjusted controlled metric for various values. This is kind of the way the model, intermediate statistics we use to generate the model in a lot of ways. And Duke is really, really stinking good in a lot of ways. They're 7th in points per game. They're 1st in the country in rushing yards per attempt in this metric. 10th in the country in passing yards per game. Really top 10 offense overall. Defensively, they're up and down between rushing and passing. It's a very poor rush defense in this estimate, but it's a top 10 pass defense, and it's 4th in the country in points per game allowed in our metrics. So Duke has just played really, really well. And again, you want to draw Utah, and I will say I haven't even looked at this beforehand, but I'll pull it up live because I'm pretty confident. Yeah, Utah is 100th in the game offensively in total yards, 44th in rushing. I mean, yards per attempt, 106 passing, 57th rushing. Defensively, 55th passing, 21st rushing. They're really not as good as Duke in any of our metrics when you consider who Duke's played, who Utah's played, and how well they've performed in those contests. So Duke just doesn't get the credit they deserve, frankly. And I know the competition's been up and down, but they've played like a team that should beat a Clemson. They've played like a team that is at the level of having the results they've gotten. And I think people just ignore it because they see the word Duke and they want to throw it out.
Well, and I think that people like to use things like Power 5 wins, right? and to me, sometimes that can be a negative. Baylor's 1-3 right now. Utah beat them by 7 points. Duke beat Clemson by 3 touchdowns, right? Duke beat Northwestern 38-14. So, okay, you have a Power 5 win in Baylor. You won by 7. Duke destroyed Northwestern. Like, what are we doing here? Like, why can we not look at the actual results in total and not just who won and who lost? Anyway, we're going to get too far down the road and lose a lot of people because we're ranting and not talking about the actual game. But to me, one of the things that I was really encouraged by when I saw the game Saturday, but worried if I'm a Notre Dame fan, is I thought Sam Hartman did pretty well in this game. My concern was, okay, he's putting up monster numbers against pretty terrible opponents. He's going to fall down to earth. They were able to run the ball competently, I think about 4.5 yards a carry. So that's encouraging because Ohio State's got a good defense. People think of Ohio State from the last few years not having a great defense. They have a very good defense this year. So that tells me they're going to be able to be competent offensively and defensively against anybody. So from that standpoint, it's really good. But, man, Mike Elko's got this defense humming. So what are your thoughts about kind of what you saw from Hartman and how you think or what you expect to see him do against Duke this weekend?
It's interesting because I think the natural conclusion for this game would be that the defenses have the advantage, right? That the defenses have played so well for Notre Dame and for Duke. Like in the Ohio State game, you'd think they would be better off. But this is where I'm going to go ahead and start jumping into the model stuff we've generated. We have this unit versus unit comparison, and we're talking about these relative performance metrics. This comparison isn't just, is your rushing yardage better? We say rushing yardage per carry offense, and we may have to tweak the way we name it to make it more clear. It's actually comparing your relative performance metrics and trying to figure out who has the advantage. And the way it comes up, it thinks that Notre Dame's rushing and passing offense has the advantage by about 17 to 18%. And it thinks Duke's offense, oddly enough, has the advantage on Notre Dame's defense by 20 to 30%. So I think what that really tells you is that these teams have played really good defenses off and on. Clemson is a very high-level defense. Ohio State was a very high-level defense. And it's extremely impressive what both of them have been able to do on the offensive side of the ball. In fact, it's so impressive in our model's point of view. It's not saying that these are bad defenses. I've already talked about some of those metrics. It just thinks that the offenses are so good that they still have the advantage in this game. I mean, Notre Dame defensively, it's really two sides of the coin. Top 25 rush defense, actually not even a top 50 pass defense in our metrics, but it's still a very good defense. And so I do think it's interesting when you bring all this up, because when you talk about these teams, you talk about what they do, you talk about the defenses they faced, it does lead sort of to this natural conclusion that with Sam Hartman and with Riley Leonard, two great quarterbacks that have been able to move the ball, they do end up having something of an advantage. And I think it really comes down to two things. One, it comes down to Hartman's ability to manage the game play to play, find the right guy, throw the ball with consistency and accuracy. And I will say more accuracy than consistency. That's sort of a fine point, but I think sometimes he has off throws, and otherwise he's great. And then with Riley Leonard, you have a guy that, to a certain degree, sort of just makes that offense. I mean, he does an incredible job of creating, running when he needs to, sometimes when he needs to, being most of the game, and then still doing things with his arm. And so when you put those together, it weirdly ends up being a more offense-driven matchup than I think most are necessarily anticipating.
But with the new clock rules, offensive matchups in terms of yards per play, maybe won't necessarily translate into what we have been conditioned to think of what a high offensive production type of game would be. The over-under is 51 on this. Notre Dame's 5.5, 5-point favorite, depending on where you look. That's not a huge number for two really competent offenses, but I think you're right. Like, neither one of these offenses has been stalled this year. Clemson is a great defense. People don't realize they might have some issues. They definitely have some issues on offense, but they are a great defense. And Duke moved the ball. Notre Dame has not had any trouble moving the ball this year. So I think that you're right that it might feel a lot more offensive-minded. And Notre Dame had a lot of that against Ohio State Saturday and came away with some empty possessions. But talk a little bit about that. We saw that with, I think, Alabama Saturday. We've seen that with a couple of other, obviously Penn State had that huge play difference. But in terms of having pretty good offensive performances but still not having any points, because we're kind of in a new world where, one, defenses have adjusted a little bit, especially in the red zone, and two, new clock rules are shortening the games.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, Notre Dame had 3 possessions in the first half versus Ohio State. 3. The average number going into this year has generally hovered around 6 to 7 possessions per half for a team. Usually you end up somewhere between 12 and 15 possessions. Notre Dame's never been a tempo team, so they hover more towards 12. But a slow game is typically around 10. If you take out the 2 end of half, because they had one play kneel downs to end both halves, they ended up with 3 possessions in the first half and only 4 possessions in the second half. That is a 7-possession ball game. It's hard for me to get across to people how utterly nuts that is. And from a team stat standpoint, I'm trying to look number of carries, number of pass attempts. It doesn't look too far off. 64 plays run. But there's something weird going on, I guess, just due to the way that first downs aren't stopping the clock, that you can get 64 plays. And if you're in an offense that's moving the ball consistently, which means you generate a lot of first downs and you have long drives, what we're starting to see is those games have a similar number of snaps, but not many possessions. Those long drives usually have a lot of stoppage in a standard game, and so that sort of adds a possession on the tail end to make up for it. Now when you have those long drives, the clock just runs the entire drive nonstop, especially when you have a high completion percentage. And so that just means the game's in quick. So again, 7 possessions here. You noted the Alabama game. Somebody was asking me about it, and I remember looking and seeing it was 9 possessions for Alabama. And I say that just because people's understanding of how many points an offense is going to score really has to shift. With the same yard per play totals, you're going to see fewer points just because there's fewer possessions. Normally, it'd be about 50% more possessions in a game than that. And if you had 50% more possessions, suddenly this game is 21 to 28, 29, 21, 30, something like that. That seems like a normal score, right, for Notre Dame versus Ohio State. And I think that's where people are going to get really screwed up and think football's taking a step back. And it really hasn't. It's just the game is effectively ending almost a quarter earlier than it used to. And I think it's really screwy thing to wrap your head around. And it's going to take us a long time to adjust too.
I do think that there's also fewer possessions because there's less explosiveness and drives have to be a little more methodical, and defenses have caught up. And I was more like, I had as much or more enjoyment watching Ohio State Notre Dame this Saturday with that low score than I have with any of these track meet games in the years past. That game was epic. So I'm really, for one, enjoying that everything is a little regressing to the mean and not this crazy RPO era. All right, Josh, when we talked about Clemson and Duke, one of the things that you called out was Riley Leonard ran a lot last year because he had to. He was the only one that had, I think, over 4.5 yards per carry or something like that. He wasn't a high yards per attempt guy. Well, he still isn't a high yards per attempt guy, but what's interesting to me is there are 2 other rushers, traditional running backs, who are over 5 yards per carry this year. Is that the difference to you possibly in, Duke was a 9-win team last year, but they still had kind of an ugly offense. Letting Riley Leonard run, because now he's running for over 8 yards per carry, Talk a little bit about maybe how much more this can open up this offense because there's actual running backs carrying the ball and being productive, and it's not all on Riley Leonard's shoulders.
Yeah, in terms of absolute rushing yards per carry, they're 16th in the country. In our opponent adjusted metric, they're actually first. This is actually the top rushing offense in the country. And to your point, Riley Leonard is running the ball 8.2 yards per attempt, which is an insane number. But in part, I think, either because of or, causing, you've got two backs in Waters and Moore that have more carries than Riley Leonard does, which was something that wasn't happening last year. And both those guys are averaging over 5 yards per attempt. 6.6 for Waters, 5.3 for Moore. And that's huge. Being able to have complementary play from your tailbacks at that kind of a level means that the offense really can run the ball consistently. I often talk about with quarterbacks, the thing that drives me nuts is when you see a quarterback leading a team in carries or leading running backs in carries when the running backs have a higher per carry average. A couple examples of that. That's happened to J.T. Barrett. That happened to Jalen Hurts just early in his career at Alabama. I think 2018, Alabama, when Jalen Hurts played was kind of weird. 2017, I know, was the big one with an incredibly loaded backfield that were all averaging just bonkers numbers in 16 and 17. Damian Harris, Josh, I can't remember if Josh Jacobs was a freshman then or not, but it was just nuts. It was like 3 or 4 NFL guys. As long as the quarterback has a higher yard per carry average, run him as much as you want. Because at that point, you're basically saying, look, you need to respect the quarterback, and if you don't, he's going to pop you worse than the running backs do. Once he has a lower yard per carry average than the backs, that basically just says you're not feeding the backs enough. The quarterback needs to be keeping the defense honest so that the running backs can be successful, not the other way around. And Duke has found that balance. In 2022, as we said, Riley Leonard led the team in attempts, 124 attempts at a 5.6 yard per carry average. Jacquez Moore actually had a higher per carry average at 6.4, but Waters was at 4.6. That was kind of fine. It was in the middle. But this year, it's clear. I mean, Leonard is not leading the team in carries, but has the highest average. So he is basically forcing the defense to defend him or they get burned hard. And that makes everybody else more successful. And that's why right now in our metrics, again, week 4, everything's weird. They are the best rushing offense in the country.
All right. So why don't we get into what the model says about this? I want to remind everybody, if you want to play around with our model, this is something that people have asked us for years. Is like, hey, can you I know you're not going to do a preview on this game, but can you tell us what the model says? Well, now you can go to our website. It's free, and you can just play with the model as much as you want, any 2 FBS teams. And all of these models, again, just a caveat as Josh gets ready to talk about it, we are still very early in the season. Our model does not use priors. It does not use recruiting rankings or anything like that. It is just the data we have this year. And if you look at these 2 teams and others, these 2 teams have one good team that they've played, together, 2 really, 1 each. But then they've got Lafayette, Northwestern, UConn, and then everybody they've played has FCS, bad G5, bad P5. So there's not a lot of connective tissue yet. It'll get better as we go along. But there's still some things that we can draw from the model, and it's still fun to play with. We give that caveat because it's got some weird, things going on right now. But it's still a lot of fun to play with. So, Josh, what does the model say about this one?
Yeah, it's interesting because our model actually favors Duke, 30 to 25. And, there's often 2 sides. And I say the score is the thing that people get hung up on. Score is also the hardest thing to model computationally in a predictive way. It's just hard to come up with the actual score of a game is going to be based on yardage. So often I almost pay more attention to the yards per play, and that's interesting because Notre Dame outgains Duke in this 6.37 to 5.64 yards per play. Why is that? Well, it shouldn't be necessarily shocking. If you watch that Ohio State-Notre Dame game, Duke is a little better at converting yards into points. Now, our model is not that simplistic, but it does kind of come down to that concept and truth. Notre Dame just isn't as good at generating actual scoring from successful yardage output, whereas Duke is a little better at continually finding ways to score points from their output. And the 2 big things I'll note here, one is the yard per attempt average for Duke is actually expected to be higher than Notre Dame, and that goes to how good Duke's defense has been. I think. And two, the yard per carry averages are very high for both teams and a little higher for Notre Dame than Duke. So as much as I've talked about Duke's rushing offense being the best, I've also noted Duke's rushing defense in our metrics is not very good. And so you end up with a situation where both offenses are really predicted to have the advantage. But it doesn't end up being bonkers numbers. It kind of balances out run and pass based on the strength of each team. You end up with what is expected to be I won't say a high-scoring game, but a fairly high-scoring game, given the caveats we made about game length earlier. 25 to 30-point projection favoring Duke. Nothing too crazy. And if you were to look at the yard per play differential, that's maybe a little more in line with Vegas, where it's about a field goal favorite for Notre Dame. Just straight up in terms of yardage.
All right, I'm ready to pick this one. This is an impossible game to pick, in my opinion. It's really hard. I think Vegas, the number that Vegas has reflects two things, I think. One, Notre Dame put their heart and soul in that game Saturday, and they're going to be a little bit deflated. Two, Duke is actually a good football team. And they're not going to lose money on this just because of brand name, like some voters will do just because of brand name. I think Duke's a really good football team, and I'm actually picking them to win this game. I think Notre Dame is a top 7 team in the country right now on a neutral field, not coming immediately off of a loss to Ohio State. And this is the tough thing about Notre Dame's scheduling is we've always said this. It's not their fault when they schedule teams and they end up not being great. They had all those games with Virginia Tech when Virginia Tech sucked, but it was off of the heels of them winning 10 games every year. Things like that, they can't control. Well, the inverse is also true. They can't control when they catch a Duke in a good year. And, I imagine they scheduled Duke after Ohio State for a reason. And so this is more about sequencing than it is about Notre Dame. I'm picking Duke to win this 24-23, and I'll give you one other thing about this to chew on as you talk about your prediction, Josh. To me, the Clemson score is very informative. I think there's a lot going on there that tells us a lot of things. But really, the 38-14 in Northwestern is a big deal to me. Northwestern is not a good football team, but they beat Minnesota. They're a team with a pulse. They are a P5 team with a pulse. And Duke did a thing that really good teams do, is they handle their business against a mediocre team. That's not something even good Duke teams in the past have generally done. To me, that's a signal that they're better than just a caught Clemson in the first game of the year kind of thing. And so that's one of the reasons I really like them. Give me Duke 24, Notre Dame 23, and tell me what you got.
I'm going to take Duke as well, 31-27 over Notre Dame. We often say anytime we're picking a score within 7 points, that's really us just saying that it's going to be a very close game and it won't surprise us either way if someone wins. I forget the win percentage, but if you're a touchdown favorite, it's somewhere around 60 to 70%. It's not particularly high. So you got to be a little reasonable with it. But yeah, pointing to the Northwestern game, Riley Leonard was 11 yards per attempt in that game. Duke ran for over 250 yards. I think 6.7 yards per carry. That's pretty crazy numbers. And I know Northwestern's not the greatest team in the world, but the point is, when they've played bad teams, they throttled them. Which, to Daniel's point, when you talk about what really good teams do, when they play bad competition, they make them look bad. That's kind of consistently the point. And so that really makes you think that the Clemson game isn't as much a fluke as a lot of people probably are thinking. This is a legitimately good Duke team. This is a Duke team that right now legitimately looks like a top 15 team, in my opinion. I think if Notre Dame, and I'm curious if you agree with me on this, Daniel, if Notre Dame was playing Duke in a month, spaced out with a couple more average teams in between, I would be picking Notre Dame. But in this spot, coming off,
I was gonna say the same exact thing to you when you finish your segment. Was if these teams played later, or if they played in week 2 or 3, I'm already still high. Like, I was high on Duke coming into the season. I was one of the few people that was saying that. I would have picked Notre Dame, but in this spot, like you said, it's just tough.
Yeah, it is. It is tough. Duke is clicking on all cylinders. I think Notre Dame has every chance to win this game, but it's going to be hard just because Duke is really good. And again, we've talked a lot about a lot of different things. There's probably a million players who are screaming at us for not mentioning more. The Notre Dame running backs or Hartman or details. Look, we're 30 minutes into the video recording, so we can only say so much. But it really comes down to the fact that I think these are just two very good teams. I think Notre Dame, though, coming off a really exhausting game, and it's not so much to me even really that it's a heartbreaking loss. I think this problem exists if it's a win or a loss. Duke has the advantage of coming in after UConn and really just they've got their sights dead set on Notre Dame, and it. And there's no way Notre Dame has been focused on playing Duke. And at some level with 18 and 20-year-old kids, that does matter, one. And two, from a very tangible perspective, there's so much time that these kids can devote to film prep and review. And I guarantee you the Duke players are spending every waking moment they can getting ready for this game. And there's no way the Notre Dame players who probably put everything they could into the Ohio State game, they can't stay up till midnight watching film multiple weeks in a row. They got to do laundry. They got to study for tests. That's just not realistic. So it's a brutal spot for Notre Dame in a game that I do think Notre Dame, like you said, I think Notre Dame is legitimately a top 7 or top 8 team. I think they are the better team. But coming off such a big game, I just can't pick them to beat a team that I think is a top 15 team in Duke.
All right, y'all, that's it for us on this one. Remember, collegefootballnerds.com. You can play around with our model. You can also see all these relative to performance statistics that really like both of these teams, by the way. It's something that we really have just kind of enjoyed for ourselves kind of over the years, and we decided to give it all to y'all. So go check it out, collegefootballnerds.com. Let us know in the comments what you think this game is going to look like, if we're crazy, if we're not crazy. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.